everything collapsed the moment Russia discovered its depth, no longer guaranteed safety. The first reports were deliberately vague, filtered through official language designed to preserve calm. Air defenses had engaged targets, debris had fallen, control was maintained. Yet the geography betrayed the truth. These were not border skirmishes or contested zones. These strikes reached into spaces long treated as untouchable, areas assumed to be protected by distance, infrastructure, and reputation alone. For years, Moscow's authority rested on a simple premise: escalation could be managed because the core was unreachable. That premise shaped procurement decisions, public messaging, and strategic risk tolerance. Early warning systems were built to watch outward, not inward. Command structures were optimized for external threats, not embarrassment. When drones slipped through, it was not merely a technical failure, it was a doctrinal one. The material damage was limited, no decisive assets were destroyed, no immediate military balance shifted. What changed was psychological. The state's promise of control fractured in real time. Citizens saw smoke where there should have been certainty. Markets registered unease before officials admitted vulnerability. Silence replaced confidence. Every layer of reassurance relied on secrecy. And secrecy collapses instantly once exposure becomes routine under sustained pressure. This was not panic. It was something colder, a recognition that assumptions had been quietly invalidated, that defensive strength, long asserted as fact, depended on conditions that no longer existed. The system responded with restraint because it lacked clarity, not because it possessed it. The unanswered question was not how the strike happened, but how many similar gaps still remained undiscovered. Russia's air defense around Moscow was never a single shield. It was a layered promise assembled over decades, designed more to reassure than to adapt. Radars covered expected corridors, interceptors guarded symbolic sites. Command centers assumed warning time as a given. The architecture worked only if threats followed precedent. Altitude and direction, Moscow had already decided, were reasonable. Doctrine hardened those assumptions. Procurement rewarded visibility over resilience. Aging systems remained deployed because replacement signaled weakness. Corruption siphoned maintenance budgets, while paperwork certified readiness. Officers learned that reporting gaps carried professional risk. While affirming coverage brought promotion, the system optimized for appearances, not performance. The most consequential weakness was not hardware, but coordination. Detection, authorization, and engagement were separated by layers of approval meant to prevent accidents, not defeat to surprise. When low-cost drones exploited altitude gaps and civilian airspace clutter, the response window collapsed. No single failure triggered penetration. Dozens of small delays accumulated until interception became optional. Public explanations framed these events as isolated lapses. That framing collapses under inspection. Structural fragility behaves consistently across time and stress when defenses are calibrated for parades rather than persistence. Surprise becomes routine. Markets understand this instinctively. Insurance premiums rose, transportation schedules adjusted, quiet capital movement reflected a reassessment of risk long before officials acknowledged it. Institutional credibility eroded because credibility depends on predictability. A state that claims total coverage must deliver total coverage every time. Partial success reads as failure when the promise is absolute. Each intercepted drone amplified scrutiny of the ones that were not. Each denial invited forensic attention. Internal audits stalled, legal responsibility diffused upward, and no mechanism existed to force correction, leaving commanders protected by process while the system continued operating exactly as designed despite mounting evidence of exposure and accountability absent. The unanswered pressure point remains simple and dangerous. Whether leadership recognized these weaknesses and accepted them or believed their own assurances until exposure made denial impossible. Ukraine did not arrive at this capability suddenly. It was assembled under pressure, constraint, and constant observation. When conventional advantages were unavailable, adaptation became doctrine. Indigenous drone programs expanded quietly, prioritizing range, navigation resilience, and low observability over spectacle. Attrition warfare forced discipline. Every system lost produced data. Every failure refined a targeting logic. This was not innovation for headlines, it was preparation for leverage. The strategic calculation was patient. Ukraine understood that symbolic retaliation invites escalation without advantage. Instead, it pursued asymmetric reach, calibrated to alter assumptions rather than destroy assets. Deep strikes were delayed until survivability, repeatability, and plausibility aligned. By the time they appeared, they carried meaning beyond damage. They demonstrated persistence, learning, and restraint applied selectively. These operations exploited geography and bureaucracy simultaneously. Low-altitude flight paths blended with civilian clutter. Launch platforms shifted constantly. Attribution, ambiguity, constrained response options. Each penetration forced Russia to spend disproportionately on defense, inspection, and reassurance. Cost exchange favored the attacker, not through volume, but through psychological taxation imposed on a centralized state. Accustomed to perimeter security, years of attrition created this moment. Battlefield stalemate hardened expectations, supply chains adapted. Legal authorities expanded quietly to accommodate domestic production. International partners watched but did not direct. Ukraine internalized the lesson that survival depended on self-sufficiency and timing. When the strikes came, they reflected accumulated restraint, not desperation. The escalation lies in intent. These were signals sent with precision, not acts of exhaustion. Strategic depth shrinks not when territory is lost, but when planning assumptions collapse. Each successful reach inward redraws the map of risk Moscow must now consider daily. What remains deliberately undefined is how often this lever will be pulled, and how far Ukraine is prepared to normalize the unthinkable. That uncertainty now governs every defensive calculation, forcing responses without clarity, exhausting institutions, and leaving decision-makers confronting choices they postponed. Believing distance alone could indefinitely substitute for strategy and control narratives. Inside the Russian state, response did not consolidate, it fragmented. Military spokespeople cited interception success, while regional officials admitted damage. Security services launched investigations without jurisdiction. Ministries contradicted timelines. Each statement sought insulation rather than clarity, because clarity assigns responsibility, and responsibility is radioactive inside systems built to diffuse blame upward until it disappears. Command paralysis emerged from design. Authority is distributed to prevent rivals, not to ensure speed. Decision chains lengthened as approvals climbed. Ladders never meant to move quickly. Every delay was procedural, defensible, and cumulative. By the time consensus formed, the event had already passed, leaving only narrative management and internal audits carefully scoped to avoid conclusions. This machinery produces predictable behavior under stress. Agencies protect mandates. Generals defer to civilians. Civilians defer to security organs. Security organs defer to secrecy. No node owns failure, so failure persists. The public saw this in real time as explanations shifted tone without changing content. Confidence hardened into repetition. Repetition replaced credibility. Elite confidence fractured quietly, not through public dissent, but through risk aversion. Projects paused, travel altered, briefings narrowed, markets priced uncertainty faster than officials acknowledged it. Capital seeks certainty, not reassurance, and certainty was absent. The state responded by tightening information flow, mistaking silence for stability. Legal mechanisms compounded paralysis. Investigations require authorization from the same leadership exposed by their findings. Oversight bodies report to those they would need to indict. Correction demands admission, and admission threatens careers built on infallibility. The result is motion without movement, activity without outcome. This is not collapse. It is strain operating at capacity. The system continues because it always has, absorbing shocks by spreading them thinly across institutions designed to survive blame. What remains unresolved is whether such a structure can correct course at all, or whether every attempted adjustment will be filtered, delayed, and neutralized before it ever reaches the point where failure could be confronted directly before consequences compound. Deterrence functions only when belief survives contact with reality. In this case, belief eroded faster than response could compensate. Russia's deterrent posture relied on layered threats, escalation dominance, and the presumption that violations would be punished predictably. Deep strikes punctured that logic. They occurred without immediate, visible retaliation, and that absence carried strategic meaning louder than any statement. Externally, partners recalibrated. States that had deferred to Russian red lines began treating them as negotiable. Adversaries measured reaction time, not rhetoric. Deterrence is relational, not declarative, and every actor watches how power answers challenge. When response lags, credibility decays. Markets internalize this quickly. Risk premiums widen. Long-term contracts hedge instability. Strategic patience becomes a liability when unpredictability replaces fear. Internally, the damage was sharper. Deterrence depends on domestic confidence as much as foreign perception. When the population observes violations without consequence, the myth of omnipotence fractures. Security assurances sound procedural rather than absolute. The state compensates with language invoking restraint, proportionality, and investigation. These words are signals of constraint, not control. Allies read this restraint as hesitation, legal justifications multiply to delay commitment, diplomatic channels thicken with explanation, buying time while signaling caution. Each clarification reduces ambiguity, and reduced ambiguity weakens deterrence further by exposing limits once kept deliberately vague. Escalation ladders destabilize under these conditions. If low-level incursions succeed, repetition becomes rational. If retaliation escalates suddenly, it appears impulsive. The space between these options narrows with every incident left unanswered. Commanders confront a dilemma: act and risk uncontrolled escalation, or absorb and normalize penetration. Both paths degrade deterrence differently, but neither restores it fully. History offers no comfort here. Deterrence failures rarely announce themselves with catastrophe. They unfold through accumulation, each tolerated breach lowering the threshold for the next. The critical uncertainty is not whether escalation continues, but where it manifests, because the longer response remains ambiguous, the more actors will test limits simultaneously, forcing decisions under pressure with diminishing room for strategic calibration. The security response followed a familiar trajectory inward. When external control weakens, internal control tightens. Surveillance authorities expanded quietly, justified as precaution. Data retention widened. Movement scrutiny increased. Arrest targeted messengers rather than mechanisms. Censorship hardened under legal language designed to appear temporary while becoming permanent. None of this addressed airspace gaps or command latency. It addressed anxiety. Security organs are optimized for compliance, not correction. They hunt dissent because dissent is measurable. Technical failure is not. Resources flowed toward monitoring populations instead of auditing systems. Blame shifted from infrastructure to individuals, from planning to loyalty. Scapegoating restored hierarchy without restoring capability. Public psychology adjusted accordingly. Confidence receded, replaced by caution. People learned which questions not to ask. Markets reacted with defensive behavior. Capital favoring liquidity over investment. Consumer signals flattened. The state interpreted quiet as stability, misreading fear as consent. Historical patterns repeat here with precision. Repression substitutes for competence when institutions cannot adapt under scrutiny. Legally, the turn inward carried consequences. Emergency authorities normalized extraordinary powers, oversight bodies receded, courts deferred. Each procedural step appeared rational in isolation, yet together they narrowed the state's ability to learn. Information bottlenecks thickened, feedback loops broke, security reports confirmed loyalty, not effectiveness. The escalation is structural. As pressure increases, the system doubles down on the tools it controls best. Surveillance expands because it can. Censorship intensifies because it works immediately. Arrests reassure elites because they demonstrate action. Meanwhile, the original vulnerability persists untouched, quietly accumulating risk. What remains unresolved is duration. Repression can delay reckoning, but it cannot replace performance indefinitely. Every inward turn consumes political capital and managerial attention. The longer the system polices symptoms instead of causes, the more brittle it becomes, raising the unanswered question of how much internal control is required before control itself becomes the primary liability. That liability grows invisibly, compounding stress while leaders insist containment remains complete even as warning signs multiply beyond tolerance. Strategic depth ends the moment it can no longer absorb pressure without systemic consequence. That threshold has been crossed. When strikes reach deep territory repeatedly, distance stops functioning as defense and becomes merely space to be traversed. The distinction matters because Russian strategy was built on depth as insurance, allowing time to react, message in and intimidate that insurance is expired. Defenses did not fail once. They failed as a category. Institutions responded exactly as designed. Denial, diffusion, repression, delay, deterrence, adjusted not through restored fear, but through managed ambiguity. None of this reverses the underlying condition. A system calibrated for invulnerability cannot adapt quickly to permeability without dismantling its own myths, and those myths are the glue holding authority together. This is why the moment is irreversible. Strategic depth is not reclaimed by intercepting the next drone or arresting the next critic. It is reclaimed by restoring predictability, and predictability requires trust in institutions that can acknowledge weakness and correct it. That capacity is absent. Every corrective pathway runs through the same bottlenecks that produce paralysis. Every reform threatens elites whose survival depends on the pretense of total control. Externally, the recalibration is already underway. Risk calculations have shifted. Escalation management no longer assumes sanctuary. Internally, governance tightens while effectiveness erodes. And the state expends energy proving control rather than exercising it. Markets, populations, and adversaries respond to outcomes, not declarations. This is not a turning point. Turning points imply choice. This is a condition. Once depth is penetrated with regularity, the cost of restoration exceeds the cost of adaptation, and adaptation under these constraints favors coercion over competence. The future therefore remains unstable, not because collapse is imminent, but because correction is structurally blocked. What follows is not resolution but exposure, a permanent narrowing of options where every response carries risk, every delay compounds vulnerability, and every assertion of strength invites the next test, unanswered for now. No authority has articulated how this condition ends, only how it is managed, leaving actors operating inside shrinking margins where miscalculation multiplies, consequences accelerate, and silence precedes decisions.